Welcome everyone. I am Nellie Herman. Many of you probably know me by now, having come to these events before. If you are new to our events, welcome to Narrative Medicine Rounds. On behalf of the Division of Narrative Medicine at Columbia University Irving Medical Center, I welcome all of you. Narrative medicine arose at Columbia in 2001 and is now an international movement at the intersection of humanities, the arts, clinical practice, and healthcare justice. Narrative training equips clinicians to humbly try to comprehend their patients' experiences and perspectives so as to deliver equitable and effective healthcare. Rigorous training and practice of narrative medicine helps all those interested in person-centered, respectful healthcare to deepen their self-awareness, clinical attunement, collaborative skills, and creative capacities. Our commitments to healthcare justice underlie our writing, teaching, research, advocacy, and delivery of care. The narrative medicine community assembles monthly here at Rounds to grow our knowledge, partnership, and commitment to a just and effective healthcare future. Before I introduce our guest tonight, I'm just going to mention a few very basic Zoom rules that all of you are very familiar with, I'm sure by now. First is just please keep your microphone muted. Be forewarned if there are any disruptions or inappropriate comments in the chat, you may be removed from the event. During the talk, we ask that you keep the chat interactions to a minimum. I will cue all of you at a certain point to start putting questions into the chat. But before then, we won't be looking at it or monitoring it. So just ask that you hold any thoughts or questions until I cue you. The event is being recorded, so everyone who registered will get a link to the recording in a day or two after the event, and you can share it as you wish. Captioning will be available during tonight's event. And at the end of the event, we'll have a link to online bookstores for you to order the books or find out more information about our speaker and about the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics and the program in narrative medicine. Okay, so now on to the fun part. I'm very excited to welcome tonight, Anna DeForest. Really welcome back, Anna DeForest, because as I'm sure she will tell you, she is a graduate of Columbia Medical School and has participated in narrative medicine work. She is the author of A History of Present Illness, which we will speak about. A novel book list calls Brutal and Brave one of the best in the making of a doctor genre. Anna's work has appeared in the Alaska Quarterly Review, the Journal of the American Medical Association, the New England Journal of Medicine, and the Paris Review. Anna has an MFA from Brooklyn College and an MD from Columbia University, currently works in palliative care at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Anna DeForest.
Thank you so much, Nellie. That was a really sweet introduction. When I was thinking about being here, I thought I would be very sad to not be in Washington Heights, in that room in the graduate faculty club where we used to hold narrative medicine grand rounds when I was a medical student. But then when all the folks were in the chat calling out their various locations throughout the United States and the world, I was like, oh, maybe this is better. So it's so cool that everyone's here. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. So what I've done for tonight is I've prepared some remarks, reflections on my work and why I do it. And then I'm going to read those with great animation. And then when I'm done reading those remarks, I'm going to read to you from my book. This shouldn't take too long, and then we can just have an open conversation and chat. So I'll just get started. I never use slides in talks like this, but for this talk, I really did think about it. I think maybe I wanted to hide a little, but when it came down to it, there was only one slide I wanted to make because I wanted to show you something, a photograph, an aerial photograph of a large labyrinth in the Anatole Mountains of South Africa. The purpose of this photo would have been to demonstrate a feeling. The feeling is a feeling I've been having a lot lately, a feeling related to recursion. There's a joke that goes, to understand recursion, you must understand recursion. The simplest definition of recursion is return, to come back again. Wikipedia says recursion occurs when the definition of a concept depends on a simpler version of itself. This is what the labyrinth was going to stand for. A labyrinth is not a maze. It is unicursal, one path that leads to the center after a series of loops or cutbacks, a single path which you follow in and then turn around and fall out, often in silence as a form of meditation or prayer. I think about this often lately because I'm old enough now to have noticed the recurrence of themes and objects in my life. The meaning, in most cases, completely unclear, but the patterning of the repetition causes a sense of order to emerge, like a theme in a song, and you feel that it means something, but you don't know what. And that's as close as we get sometimes to understanding. I was walking a labyrinth once, just on the proximal part of Cape Cod on the shoulder, when a bunch of school-aged children arrived and started sort of running it from behind me. And one of them said really loudly, "This maze is hard," which is a fun way to describe a repetitive path to a known destination. This maze is hard. Of all the book talks I have given, this one means the most to me, because Columbia is where I wrote the first draft of my first book, and narrative medicine, I'm proud to admit, was a big part of how I survived medical school. Columbia's medical school is deeply infused with narrative medicine, now even more so, I'm sure, than 10 years ago when I was there and first heard Rita Sharon speak. The way I remember it is that Rita spoke to us the very first day during orientation in a large auditorium where we all sat stock still and nervous. The work everyone was doing to prepare us for what was about to be done to us was only worsening our overall sense of doom. Well, I'll speak for myself. Narrative medicine, I always tell medical people, is not just reading a poem on rounds, and then we read a poem on rounds. The poem that Rita had us read that day was Days by Philip Larkin. It is short, so I'm going to read it to you now. What are days for? Days are where we live. They come, they wake us, time and time over. They are to be happy in. Where else can we live but days? Ah, solving that question brings the priest and the doctor in their long coats, running over the fields. Ah, solving the question. Medical students will always try to solve the question too. I remember one burly guy raised his hand that day with Rita to say how good it is that the doctor is running. I learned a lot about medical students in those years. One thing I learned is that a lot of medical students don't understand non-literal language. Writing this, I first wrote medical students struggle to understand non-literal language, and then I had to correct it, because although a lot of them had this problem, it is not true to say they were struggling with it. A lot of my peers seem quite comfortable in this world where it's okay to behave as if everything that matters is either, in fact, quite concrete, or anyone who pretends otherwise is psychiatrically ill or being intentionally oblique. It may sound like I'm picking on medical students here, but I'm not. I'm picking on doctors. What is so important about understanding non-literal language? So that when the wife of a man dying of glioblastoma tells you that he always wanted brain surgery, you know that she means he always wanted to see his daughter graduate from high school, not that he always wanted to have his head cut open. That when a father of a son who is warm but dead, who is brain dead, when he asks, how did it end? He is not asking about the impact of swelling on the anatomy of the brainstem. Two things to say over and over about language. Language is how we come to know each other. So taking an interest in what the others say is the only way to come to know them. to really know them, instead of treating them like an external representation of the notions about them and people who seem to be like them that our brains construct out of habit. The other thing about language, about your own language, is that by examining it, you can learn who you are. You can turn it over to find how the things you have come to do and the culture you move in have changed what you think and what you believe without you noticing. Language is a cultural phenomenon. And in-group's language both reinforces and reveals the values of the group that speaks it. The in-group language of medicine, of course, includes specialized vocabulary to describe the biochemical processes of the body and the technologies we inflict upon it. But additionally, the in-group language of medicine is specialized to hide power, evade blame, and navigate vaguely around the things we doctors do not value or understand. As I was preparing these brief remarks, I found a little journal entry from late in med school when I was studying for one of those big tests they make us take. Step 1, it's called, as if it didn't take 1,000 tedious steps to arrive at. And in my downtime from studying 12 or more hours a day, I would take breaks and swim laps in an Olympic-sized pool, because this is what everyone I knew did to cope. To the gym is where you go to work out psychological distress. Anyway, the journal essentially said, I'm studying a lot, I'm going to the gym, and I'm not good at medicine. If medicine is tests and trivia, and this is the quote, since I spend all of my time trying to pass at this, I have stopped doing or being whatever I used to do or be that made me feel like I was worth anything. And as I accept my life this way, I am readjusting my values to accept this world the way that it is. And then I get this creeping feeling that I will definitely die one day, regretting my entire life. I'll be thinking, you should have been more brave, but I still won't know what that means. That's what it said in my journal. Sometime after I wrote that, and before graduation, I started writing a history of present illness. The heart of the early draft was the notion of brain death, a sticky linguistic construction, a medical and legal definition around which the clumsy language of life and death sometimes falls apart completely. How much does it matter what we call things? I started to convince myself it matters quite a lot. And I want to note here, to the credit of this university, that I was allowed to write this as coursework. While my peers did research projects in the lab or clinical research, I worked with Rita Sharon and wrote a novel. I found a voice, a narrator, who could ask the question that I was asking myself: who will I be in this role of doctor? And as that narrator examines their identity, this is a family history, and this is a spiritual history, and so on, their identity disintegrates. They become only the person who does the things that they are doing. And this is not, as it first appears, pathological. The essential solidness of anyone's identity disintegrates upon examination. Identity is the baggage of our assumptions. Only by dropping those can we see ourselves as we truly are and see others as anything other than the creatures of our imagination. There is a third thing I want to say about language. What is the relationship between language and suffering? Because it is suffering, I find, sitting at the heart of life in medicine, and the work demands that we formulate a response to this. Elaine Scarry writes, so long as one is speaking, the self extends out beyond the boundaries of the body. Only in silence do the edges of the self become coterminous with the edges of the body it will die with. Among all of the many things which we cannot see and do not know about the other, his pain, which is to him so emphatically real, is completely invisible to us. So much depends on what he can say. Suffering destroys language, and to heal from suffering requires language be reassembled. The best motivation for the assembly of a language from nothingness and despair is having a listener, someone to listen to you deeply. Barring that, you must learn to listen to yourself. I, of course, survived medical school. I graduated, I passed that test and several other tests, and I started residency, and we started having this pandemic, and millions of people died. And this is the setting in which I finished training and became a full-fledged grown-up doctor. I work in palliative care. It will surprise no one because I remain primarily interested in communication and in suffering, and in remaining vitally aware, as James Lowe puts it, of the sheer mystery of being alive and not being dead. So that's just a little bit of my recursive path to this moment. And now I'll read to you a little from the book, and then we can talk. This is from an early chapter called Reaction Formation. This was in the emergency ward for psych patients. The doors stayed locked and the guards were armed. The patient was a young woman with fresh cuts up both her arms, ticks like marking time. The thin white doctor didn't ask her why. The psychiatrist will tell you it's never a good move to take a trauma history. The patients love to rehash it. They just go on and on. But how could it not matter if she had been abused as a child, beaten by her mother, or neglected, or if some stepfather had asked her for a favor, asked her to go to the basement to change the wash clothes over to the dryer, say, and watched her down the dark, wet steps, then closed the door and locked it. Maybe she was afraid after that of men or of the dark. Maybe she always had been. Doctors call these patients borderline. Depression is a mood disorder, something wrong with how you feel. Borderline is a personality disorder, something wrong with who you are. Her hair had been done, blown out, you could see, with a round brush. Like all of the patients in the ward, she'd been removed from her clothes and put in a gown, and her shoes had been taken, and she'd been given socks with rubber treads on the bottom and on the top, so that there was no way they could be put on upside down. The doctor spoke very softly, steepling his fingers below his chin. They seemed meant to make him appear gentle, approachable, but just served to make the woman have to lean in close to hear him. Over his soft voice, you could hear shouting from the hall, even with the door closed, and see through the glass the voice's source, a strong young man with tattooed arms shouting over and over, "That's not a promise, it's a threat." The doctor had been looking for disorganized thought. He asked her if she ever felt that things in the world had a special significance. Like what? The radio, the newscast, the shape of the clouds. She said she'd been counting streetlights, that whenever she walked under them, they went out. A new building had sprung up across the river. It was all made of glass with a tint that made it disappear in certain conditions of the light. You could see only the ribs, the window frames. It looked about 100 stories high. Who would even want to live there? So up in the air like that? Asked a woman whose father was dying in the ICU. We were at his bedside. The hope was to send him home on hospice, but he had made the mistake of coming to terms with his imminent death in the late afternoon on a Friday. So he was stuck with us at least through the weekend. "I bet the floors sway in the wind up there," she said. "I bet it stirs the ice in your glass." And I agreed. I said, "I don't think I could live like that." An example of classical conditioning. They took a baby, 9 months old, a stolid and unemotional infant per report, and exposed him to a white rat over and over while striking a steel bar with a hammer behind his head. Little Albert. He quickly learned to scream at just the sight of the rat, and then extrapolated further, screaming at dogs, furs, bearded Santas. His mother, prudent at the worst possible moment, pulled him from the study before the process could be reversed. She had been paid $1 for his time. We still do a lot of harm, to rats at least. In an animal model for post-traumatic stress, rats were locked in colored cages and administered electric shocks, then moved to other colored cages and observed to see how they reacted. Certain rats did not relax, couldn't tell the difference, kept waiting for the current to come light them up. These were the pathological rats. Researchers examined these troubled rats' genetics, looking for the exomes that coded for their poor resilience. Elsewhere in concussion studies, they built a small machine, a sort of blunt rat guillotine, to give all the subjects identical head injuries. Little Albert, of course, is not a sad story about a rat. They had to hold her in the emergency ward for 72 hours, the mandatory sentence for considering suicide. She had a boyfriend or some kind of partner who waited outside for the brief time visitors were allowed, the most beautiful man any of us had probably ever seen. He kept trying to break her out. He would chase the thin white doctor through the halls outside the ward. The patient was white, the partner too, otherwise it's hard to imagine the doctors would have put up with them. It's true there was nothing to do for her, so they kept her quiet on antipsychotics and in bed. As a compromise, the guards let the boyfriend bring coffee in as long as it was cold. The cot beside hers held a woman who spoke no English and sobbed at all hours, drowning out the television. It was a mistake, the boyfriend said. The thin, sharp marks all down her arms, the same size as little staples, bringing her here, he said. Sometimes she would cry and he would sit beside her on the bed and the armed guard would shout, "Don't do that." The treatment she needed, dialectical behavioral therapy, took many weeks and used worksheets. The psychologist who invented this intervention called these patients the most miserable people in the world. Upstairs, there were whole wards full of people who'd gone mad, gone off their medication, started stripping in the streets. They cried at night for born and unborn children. The doctors thought up new sets of pills as they sat around a table every morning. They often repeated that electroshock therapy had gotten a bad rap. I would go into the treatment room with a man who had lost his children to time and neglect and who worried without end about a shed full of car parts he needed to get rid of. "You are like a daughter to me," he said the day we met. When I'd walk him into the little room, just a gurney and a setup for some light anesthesia, he'd say he was afraid. Maybe after that stepfather left and before the next one came, she would go down on her own and climb into the dryer, full of towels still warm. The Buddhists will tell you not to get attached to what is, after all, only a pleasant sensation. An older student rotating through the ward was planning to become a psychiatrist. He had oiled hair and a bad turn to his lips that made him look like a villain from television. He said it was a common misconception that you had to value soft skills to want to work in mental health. "Look at us, this locked unit," he said. "The patients will give you anything. They need to be led. Can you imagine another way to own a person so entirely?" He'd even gone to Vienna or wherever just to lie on Freud's couch. It's true you can't help feeling they might be to blame. The depressives especially don't even seem to try. The drugs these people take make them flat of affect. Everyone's hands shake all the time. When they do the shock treatments, they paralyze the patient so only the mind has a seizure. "Can you hold my hand?" the sad man asked, but that didn't seem appropriate. He was vacant afterwards when they rolled him out, with blood on his mouth from where he'd bitten his lip. "How did I get so old?" he would sometimes lament. "I take so many vitamins." The borderlines make for easy questions on the exams we have to take. Always a woman, poised to kill herself, superficial threats, superficial cuts, wanting attention, or what else? Somehow all these women have been harmed or assaulted in some way, and what they lose is the internal conviction that they are a person in any real sense. Identity disintegrates. But human character, it has been said, is just a vital lie. I can see the woman with the cut-up arms walk out with her beautiful boyfriend through a glass house, an atrium that used to be the space between two buildings. A nurse on the way out had said, "Don't ever come back here again." Her head on his shoulder. Before they're out of sight, she lights a cigarette. Medical students show up on the exams, sometimes too, but even there we are over-accomplished. The answer to the medical student question will always be sleep deprivation, OCD, or the overuse of prescription stimulants. I did ask Ada once if she was afraid. Ada with her binoculars, her soft encephalitis, She didn't have the words anymore to answer. There was a boat I'd noticed from my room at night. Even our little dorms, our cold rooms with old linoleum floors, faced the estuary. A small boat, no name or signage, always going to the same spot and stopping in the night. Now, through the binoculars, I got no hints. Drug run, treasure hunt. I'd seen on that river a jet ski sink just at the foot of that bridge, and I walked across the bridge and back just once and was struck by the shaking of the traffic. A guard there told me about the jumpers. He said the worst were the ones who missed the river and hit the rocks or the concrete below. The guard had a desperate and apologetic tone from having to keep saying things nobody wanted to hear. One more from the psych ward. A woman whose husband had died of a heart attack. They'd come in together, the man dead, the wife ready. She told me rather calmly that she never had much appetite for life outside of her husband. She said, "Keep me a day, and when I leave, I will kill myself. Keep me a month, and when I leave, I will kill myself," and so on. She was hard to blame. There are countries where you can get yourself euthanized for depression, chronic illness, disability, or just the firm feeling that your life is now complete. What more could we hope for? I sometimes feel this way myself, or wonder which versions of life are worth living. Believe me, a playwright said, there are people out there who do not love you. One of my classmates got a whim to go learn Portuguese. She said we should all talk less and do more, and she borrowed money from her parents for tickets to Brazil. I let myself down and spent that first summer in some collegiate suburb living with a seminarian, earning beer money by writing copy for press releases and grants. Another thing I did that summer for money was participate in research studies. I was not selected as a normal control in a study of functional MRI mapping, but they did let me enroll in a trial about cigarette smoking. They had me smoke through a foot-long tube stuck through a hole in the spine of a plastic binder to blind me, I think, to the cigarette. And sometimes the tube had special filters in it, and sometimes the cigarette was placebo, dried lettuce, the research assistant said. All this happened in a hospital room, if you can imagine, with a desk in the place where the bed should be. The pay was $300. The seminarian was writing a thesis on the very early Christians, the ones who kicked around getting martyred while Paul or whoever wrote the New Testament. They were mostly, he told me, pacifist, egalitarian, and queer, and they were obsessed with the body, fascinated with the incarnation, that there was something so crucial about existing as a body that even God had to try it out. They didn't even have a story of what Jesus died for yet. It was just a mysterious thing that had happened. He said the early Christians stood still and silent on the floor of the Colosseum as gladiators stabbed them or lions tore them to pieces, depressing the crowds who had come to see a spectacle. They believed in universal salvation, he told me, and a real resurrection of the body for everyone. Later theologians tried to pull this back to mind-body dualism by debating the shape those resurrected bodies would take. One professor asserted that the resurrected body should possess the most perfect shape, the sphere, in homage to the divine and spherical shape of the human head.
Thank you, Anna. I wish we had a clap ability on Zoom.
I'll just imagine it.
Just imagine it. That was so beautiful. And I have to start my little portion of Q&A by just, I know I've told you this already, but just saying again how much I loved your book. It's just astonishing. And I hope many of the people in the audience have already read it, but if you have not yet read it, it's just amazing. I couldn't get over it when I read it. I think partly having worked in narrative medicine for so many years and having worked with so many medical students who are trying to write and struggling with writing, and it was just incredible. Anyway, and so many questions, but I will only ask a couple, and want audience please feel free to put questions in the chat as we talk, and then I'll just ask a couple questions and then we can move to audience questions. I also do feel like I should tell everyone that I have a very, very bad headache, and then I feel like I'm a little bit underwater and maybe kind of spacey. So apologies if I don't seem my sharp self. I wanted to start by asking, I have two questions I want to be sure to ask. And the first one is about the narrators. Well, actually more than the narrator, sort of really about the structure of the book as a whole. I was rereading it over the last 2 days and, trying to write down some questions, and I was becoming sure that I wanted to ask you about the way that the narrative is put together, in the sense that we jump all over the place, as you in the audience just heard in that excerpt. We're moving in space and time. Within a paragraph we'll be in a different place with a different character. It's very unusual, and so I wanted to ask you about that. And then I hit the part like halfway through the book where you basically explain it, and I wanted to share if it's okay to read just a little bit, and because I do still want to ask you about it, but I think it makes more sense to ask you with the little excerpt from the book, because when I got to this, I thought, oh, she just answered my question. So this is just a paragraph from the book. It became apparent, or either way, I began to convince myself that the fragmentary way my life more and more occurred to me was not a burgeoning mental illness, but a product of my training. For example, it was in the nature of our profession for us to constantly approach another person, to attempt to connect, to impress upon them some incarnate lesson, and then walk out, blank slate your heart for whoever needs you next. There was no lasting emotion, no closure. The work was all notes, no narrative. So to me, that was the answer to my question, was that the structure of the book sort of mirrors that. And I'm wondering if A, yes, that's right. And B, did you know that all along, that was how you wanted to write this book? And I'm curious just about how the evolution of the book came about in that sense, knowing that you spent, 10 years writing it. Does that make sense as a question?
I think so. I think it does. A big part of the editorial process for the book was trying to make it in any way coherent. And it was hard to do because as I hammered out linear narratives, I felt like I was falsifying the document. Because anyone who's been through this training will tell you that one of the most insane things about it is how intense it is without any kind of continuity. And you don't really find out how stories end. So you're interacting with only the peak of the Freytag triangle and none of the rest of it. There's no lead up and there's no denouement. It's just suffering. For what? So I couldn't make it more linear, even though I think if I hadn't written the book, I might find it a bit irritating to read. But I think the irritation is a recreation of the trauma of interacting with the world in that way.
Absolutely. And I think for me anyway, that it came across and it made sense to me also, especially when I hit that, I said, oh, why are you even asking this question? Of course. And again, not to say too much and give too many spoilers to those who haven't yet read the book, but I do think one of the many brilliant things about it is that despite that disjunctiveness, you do manage to have a through line and to have a kind of epiphany, if you will, that comes as you move through the book, which it's just incredibly constructed book. So anyway, and I also am curious, maybe if we have time, I can ask this one too, but I think I'll skip over this, but just mention it, because I am also just curious. There seem to be so many anecdotes in here that I assume came from your work. And again, just curious in terms of constructing the novel, like, did you just have like 1,000 notes that you had taken and tried to put all these things into your narrative? I don't know, that's a different question that you don't have to answer, but one of the many things I was wondering as I was reading was just simply like, how did all these things get put in here. There's just so many aspects anyway, but I will skip to my more, I don't know, larger question maybe, which is about fiction writing. You know, I'm a fiction writer, so I think I know the answer to this question, but I want to ask it for those who maybe aren't fiction writers, and clearly, you know, fiction is where you're landing as well. But I'm curious, given the content of your book, and I know even in some of the reviews I read, you know, everybody was praising the book, but people were also saying, like, it's interesting that this is a novel and not, you know, a manifesto or whatever. And I just always think it's so interesting to talk and think about why someone writes something, why someone writes fiction, basically, because often people think fiction doesn't do any good in the world, maybe. Anyway, I'll skip over. I actually wrote, like, I took down some notes of passages in the book where I thought, okay, she's talking about fiction writing there, but I won't share them. But I'll just
maybe offline you can send those to me. I'm really interested.
But I'm just curious if you might speak a bit to what your sort of deeper thoughts are about fiction, what fiction can do in the world, why you chose to write it as a novel. What does fiction mean for you? If I know that's a huge question, but if there's something there that sparks.
Sure. Well, it's an interesting question because lots of folks will tell you maybe nonfiction is more useful. But you can write a really solid takedown, or like be a journalist and really expose something. Maybe that's more actionable. It's just completely outside of my capabilities. I don't even believe in the truth, so I could never purport to be telling it. Whenever it's the same as the craft comment I made before. As you pull something together, you make it a lie. You can't just stick with the truth. When you assemble the through lines, you have to follow the sound of the words to determine what you say next. So if I thought that they were a true story, oh gosh, that I really needed to tell, Nellie, I would be so stuck because I'd have no skills in how to write it. Because I'm a poet who is interested in collage, and I have no sense of plot, and I don't believe that it's possible to tell the truth. So I guess I make a pretty good short novelist.
Well, and that's, I mean, I'm at least one of the lines I pulled out was about telling the truth, and, you know, the idea that you kind of lie until you tell the truth, basically. And I am always wondering, I mean, I think we wonder this together as a group a lot in narrative medicine, is sort of the question of like, well, what can art do in the world? Can art really do anything in the world? And, you know, the questions of why do we write fiction over any kind of other form of expression is always so interesting to me. Because of course I believe in it very deeply. And when I read, one of the things I felt when I read your book was like, here we go, this is why. Anyway, I'm rambling, but
I think if you want to create a feeling, and I wouldn't say this is the intention of my work, but I enjoy it when it happens. When people tell me that they had a feeling, a lot of folks who have been through medical education read this book and they are very interested in the feelings that arise in them because they kind of don't remember how traumatic medical education is. And then they read the book and they say that this like stark trauma, blatant trauma is really familiar. So I've created that feeling in other people. That's what I'm going around doing. But you don't do that by telling the truth. You do that by like making something that sounds, in a way, it's sound sense and lyrical. It's musical and like deeply in the ancient brain. So
yes,
I don't know.
oh, absolutely. I mean, that's always what I'm saying to my students about fiction is like, you're actually enacting the experience for your reader as opposed to telling them about it, which is a very different thing. But speaking of students, one more question, and then I'll turn to audience questions. I see a couple coming in. You know, having worked with lots of medical students who are often trying to write about their medical training and things that they see in the hospital, I thought, you know, I should honor them by asking you just in general, because I think, you know, your book is a model of what can be done. I was just thinking about all the things that come up when when we're working together as things that are stopping them from pursuing the writing. And one thing that I hear over and over again is, the sort of ethical concerns about writing about things that happen in the hospital, writing about patients, and often people really can't get beyond it in order to write. And I assume maybe you'll say, well, fiction writing is one way to get beyond it, but I'm just curious if you have anything to say about that process for you, and being in this world and trying to write fiction while you go, I don't know, anything that.
Yeah, well, it actually again points to my answer to the question about why I don't write nonfiction, because to work in our jobs, to be entrusted with the things that our patients trust us with, and then to write nonfiction about your experiences, like that's a little dicey. And so to do that, from what I understand, and I've done a little bit of it, you have to work really hard to de-identify people. And if you're stripping away all of the personal details to then talk about an illness for a medical journal, that's one thing. But for me, the piece is that I'll change all the medical details just to keep the gesture, and the gesture is the thing that I wanted. And that's what I'm taking from the patients. And I think about that. It has ethical weight to be at all transactional in a patient encounter to get anything from it. But I hope it's worth it. And I think that it probably is.
Has it happened yet that your patients have read your book?
No, but recently in a very difficult patient situation, a family member mentioned that she was aware of my book and that she was really excited about it. And I suggested maybe she not read it right now because it's a bit of a downer.
Fair. Yes, which, one of the many things I loved about it. I love a dark book. And this is definitely a brutal book. I mean that in the best way. Okay, so I'm gonna look at, we have a few questions coming in here. Let me read some of these for you. And apologies for not inviting all of you to ask your questions yourself. I think I'll just read them. Let's see, Craig Blinderman, maybe asks, I wonder, since the book was published, have you heard from other doctors or medical students that they have had familiar experiences, anguished feelings about their training, feelings of alienation, disappointment, self-doubt, etc.? While it may be surprising for non-medical readers to appreciate your subjective experience and the intimations and lessons you learned, they are actually very familiar to those of us who have gone through medical training, or at least it feels very alive for me and resonated with my own experiences. Regardless, it is through your incredible writing that you were able to express the truth of medical training.
Thank you for that comment / question. And it's hard to be the people come to me and say, thank you for helping me rehash my trauma, and I get to be trauma guy. But I don't mind it because healthcare workers are so traumatized right now, and now more than ever, to be a person who says okay, my professional niche is that I make a safe space for us to process our medical trauma. Well, that's not too bad.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Jennifer Langdon asks, I was struck by your comment about language as the way we come to know each other and the challenges of non-literal language, particularly in medical settings. Could you speak to how we might better write or speak our bodies / the body, which languages itself through symptoms and or other profoundly non-literal ways? Wow, what a good question. My goodness.
That's a really great question. I wonder if the person who asked it has some ideas. Because when I use a lot of narrative tools to approach the question that you've asked, it's only because this is my skill set. And I think there are probably many other ways to get at it. And I know narrative medicine includes the non-verbal arts, but I'm just really stuck on language. I'm really stuck there. And I don't think it's the only way through. But any task that trains a person in attention, whether that's attention to the movement of their bodies or to their breathing or to what other people say or how other people move, that's the work. It doesn't really matter what the modality is, a kind of just very raw attention.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Karen Gold asks, can you say something? Oh, this is clearly Karen Gold has read the book. what a powerful reading / book. Can you say something about how the doctor in training / narrator's own background might be informing her view and insights into medical culture?
Well, I'm very interested in suffering, as I mentioned, just like not the sexiest thing to be interested in, but it's a universal human experience. And I think in the country that we live in the milieu of people who go to medical school, and I don't know if you all know this, but like rich people are overrepresented in medicine. 40% of medical doctors come from the top 20 percentile of American incomes. These are people who have means to avoid certain kinds of structural suffering. And if you have a notion in your head that suffering is avoidable, it's hard to meet people who are suffering and experience that interaction and the aversion that humans naturally have to suffering. It can get conflated with blame. And I think that it can be very confusing for people who are not well acquainted with suffering to encounter suffering without a structure to learn how to integrate that into their lives. So that said, I think that folks who have had a lot of adverse childhood experiences, which the narrator has, and which I don't mind saying I have had too, they have a different perspective because they know in their bones that suffering is unavoidable. Because when you're like, you endure horrible things as a child, you don't really entertain notions that you deserve it. It's just the way that life is. And for most people who have ever lived, suffering is just the way that life is. There's no need to blame anyone for it. So I think that that's maybe the role of adversity in making a person compassionate, though it doesn't always level out that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I love hearing you say that, and also to say that the book, I guess that's why the question was asked. Like, the book doesn't explicitly make that point, which I also think is pretty brilliant. Like, we see that, but it's not making that as an argument necessarily, which I appreciate too. Okay, let's see. Joanna George says, sometimes it's hard to find words in the midst of trauma, medical or otherwise. I don't know if this is even answerable. How do we tell stories from this place, from this space?
What's kind of strange, though I wonder if Nellie and other writers in the audience feel this way too, is that even in a place of great pain, there's a kind of delight that comes from finding the right way to describe something. And I don't know, that's kind of what the quote from the philosopher Elaine Scarry that I shared in my remarks about how speech allows us to transcend the limits of our bodies, that the act of taking raw human suffering, I'm imagining the physical sensation of grief in the chest, and then putting words to it, I think because it suggests the possibility of sharing the experience is already and almost immediately balming. But I don't know if that's true for everyone, because I really like words.
Well, yes, certainly I agree with that, but I also do. That comes up in talking with students a lot too. Like, sometimes people don't feel able to put language to something, and it can be actually bad for them to try. So that's interesting too, because I do think people have very varied access, I guess, to language in that way.
We had a rule in writing workshops that I taught before I was in medicine, which I bring to the writing workshops I sometimes teach in medicine, which is, if you can't say it, don't. And sometimes to just say what you can't say, to say, and then I went into that room where my father's body was in a coffin, and I cannot tell you how it felt. And that's stronger than a bad metaphor. I cannot tell you.
Yeah, that's such a good idea. I'm going to steal that if you don't mind.
If you can't say it, don't.
Yeah, that's great. And a really good answer to the original question. Let's see. Is the doctor, Francie asks, is the doctor bubble as destructive to the doctor as to their patients?
Is the doctor bubble the unfeeling affect of an objective clinician? Is that what that means?
I'm assuming that's what that means. I don't.
Yeah, if that's what, if I'm reading that correctly, then the answer is yes. I think this. I've been going around talking to big medical crowds about this exact topic. I personally believe that the duration of an emotion felt in its raw form is roughly 30 seconds, that to feel your feelings alongside your patients strengthens the relationships and increases your satisfaction with your job. And it's what you do after that. And that requires, therapy in some cases and support and counseling and mentorship to know how to feel your feelings without interfering with the clinical encounter. But the notion that emotions impair clinical objectivity is ridiculous and dated. And I think we're getting past it.
I hope so. I hope so. Yeah, we talk about that a lot as well in narrative medicine. And I agree 100%. Well, here's a very specific question for you. I don't know if you'll have any ideas. Ben Rose asks, I'm interested in trying to help solicit oncology client stories so staff can better know them beyond their present diagnosis and treatment. Any suggestions?
That's a really interesting question. One of the things I do very little of is make patients interact with writing. My patients don't write for me, and I don't ever show my patients a poem. I do a lot of intensive bedside listening, but patient narratives are really powerful. And perhaps if you're trying to train clinicians to be more attuned, having them interact with a patient narrative on paper is obviously a less charged scenario than interacting with the patient themselves. But I don't have good tools for that because I've been working more on the clinician side, how clinicians can gain these skills and use them to be better.
Yeah, someone else in the audience suggests to hire or partner with a story worker, especially one who has a lived experience of being a cancer survivor. So that's an interesting suggestion. But yeah, there also there are lots of tools out there these days. Yeah, I know someone saying, what is a story worker? We're not going to get into that here, but there are lots of different work is being done out there these days in trying to get to these questions. So all right, we have another one here. Forgive me if I'm saying your name. Yoni Che asks, thank you, Anna, for the heartfelt reflections. Language is limiting sometimes as it's not enough to tell a story. My question is, what other creative methods do you suggest apart from creative writing? While I'm not a medical student, I am doing my MA, narrative environments on a medical topic. I'm creating an experience to teach others about palinopsia in order to elicit empathy and reflection on the diversity of human sensory experiences. Honoring the stories of pain that I have been collecting from people with palinopsia is what brought me here today.
That sounds incredibly interesting. I don't have a good answer to the question because, again, my skill set, as I'm the first to admit, is strictly limited. I'm just happen to be hyperverbal, and that's it. I would rather look at words on a page than sustain eye contact with a human being, and I'm working on that. So other modalities are a bit blocked off to me, but I'm interested in, I meet people who tell me I have no relationship with language, but when I see this vista or this painting, this is everything to me. And I'm just so not that way that it's fascinating to me, the differences in people's approaches, but I can't advise you, but your work sounds fascinating.
If I may, there's so much. I would suggest that, really the sky's the limit there. It makes me think about, specifically speaking about pain, makes me think of an artist named Deborah Padfield. I forget the name of her book, but she essentially works with chronic pain patients and they make photographs together that represent the pain. And there's a whole process that she does with that. So anyway, again, not to divert us too much, but there are many modalities and many ways of working with creative work to elicit experiences and honor stories. So I too tend to be on the verbal spectrum, but I have seen amazing visual work and music. There's a lot. Let's see. Here's a good one. Again, I don't know, I'm gonna butcher the name. I apologize. Pallavi Juneha asks, asking as a current resident who also loves words, I imagine that writing a novel during training requires a lot of discipline. If so, how do you maintain your freedom and creativity within that?
Well, the book I wrote during medical school and edited during residency, it took a long time to write, and it's not very long. And it's very, as Nellie mentioned, it's very anecdotal. And I'm a binge writer, so I'd get on elective or backup Jeopardy something, and then just get the work done when I had the time, and then put it away for months. But work habits are really idiosyncratic. So I think you find a way that works for you, but don't undervalue small pieces accumulating over time.
Mhm. I mean, yeah, 10 years you worked on that book. That's amazing. And I totally second that. It's hard to be patient and it's hard to work in small bits of time, but that's often the way it comes out. All right, we're almost at time, so I'm just gonna, there are, of course, right at the end, there's more and more questions coming in. Well, someone's asking about your narrative medicine history. Maybe I'll just summarize these to you and you can pick one. Someone's asking about your path and your training in narrative medicine. How did you do that? Someone's saying, curious how we should navigate the involuntary metamorphosis that occurs in medical training while still retaining an appreciation for what it is to see the world before medicine. Beautifully written questions, people. And then the last one is, as a first-year medical student, I'm curious, do you think you have learned more of what it means to be brave yet, like you mentioned in your journal? How do you want to keep learning? Oh, that's a beautiful last question, actually.
But yeah, I like it. But the thing is, I don't know. I don't perceive what I did today as brave, and I don't perceive publishing the book as brave. And sometimes when I see the same kind of wrong happen over and over again in the hospital systems where I work, I'm just like, well, we're not really getting anywhere here, are we? And then I think of how so much of human life is to just believe in the effort, even if you strongly suspect the effort is futile. Because that's like the whole thing here, right? Like we just walk this path, we know where it ends, and we don't really know what we're doing, and the world's on fire, and we do our best. And maybe that's bravery.
Yeah, I think it has to be, right? And I do think, I mean, I don't know, maybe brave's not the right word, but I will just say from my, if I may, from my own voice, that reading your book really inspired me in the way of just the brutal honesty you present in that book and the way you don't turn away from the horrors of so much of what goes on in our culture, in our, specifically in our medical culture. And whether we call that brave, I don't know, but I appreciate it. And I think everybody in this room does too. So anyway, thank you so much for your time. We are at time. Sorry for the siren out the window. Thank you all for being here. If you haven't read this book yet, I cannot recommend it enough. I think anyone who is interested in narrative medicine should read this and probably will appreciate it. Anna, thank you so much for writing it. I cannot wait to read your next book. Really a super fan from now on.
Thank you so much, Nellie. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you. Thank you for coming back to us. I hope you'll come back again.